But if it were really about the fixed effects, I would expect that marginal R squared to be much closer to the conditional one, particularly in this case. So I frankly don't think the conclusion is necessarily supported. Okay, I saw this number last week from the College Fix, and thought to myself, no, no, no. Surely this wasn't what was written in the article. And read a little bit of the College Fix thing, and then I do want to point out a couple of things in the actual journal article that the College Fix is citing, because I do not believe the article shows what I don't think the characterizations given to the PNAS article, because the article in question that they're talking about here appears in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which I do not believe the PNAS article in question is accurately titled. Let's put it that way. There is a certain amount of framing that goes on with journal articles, as much as there is with news articles, and so it's important to take into account. Biologists: systemic racism harms birds, mammals, reptiles living in urban areas. Redlining drove out woodland creatures from minority neighborhoods, and their absence makes minority residents mentally and physically ill, biodiversity researchers argue. Systemic racism, traditionally thought of as strictly a people problem, negatively impacts the furry, feathered, and scaly members of our communities as well, according to some biologists. University of Manitoba biologists Colin Garraway and Chloe Schmidt, now at the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, made the argument in an October 2022 article published in the prestigious journal The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The College Fix reached out via email in January to both Schmidt and Garraway about the study, but did not receive a response. In their article, headlined "Systemic Racism Alters Wildlife Genetic Diversity," the duo discussed the findings of a recent study they conducted, writing that in the U.S., quote, "systemic racism has had lasting effects on the structure of cities, specifically due to government-mandated redlining policies that produce racially segregated neighborhoods that persist today." However, they noted it is not known whether varying habitat structures and natural resource availability associated with racial segregation affect the demographics and evolution of urban wildlife populations. Therefore, to investigate just how much the practice of redlining, which was outlawed by the 1968 Fair Housing Act, perturbs today's painted turtles and piping plovers, along with a small zoo's worth of other creatures big and small, Schmidt and Garraway wrote that they repurposed and reanalyzed data. Let's see. By doing so, they wrote they sought to test the hypothesis that systemic racism produces associations between neighborhood racial makeup and urban environments that alter population demography and thus evolutionary change in city-dwelling populations of amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles. Following the analysis of the data, the authors reported they found consistent relationships between the genetic composition of wildlife and the racial composition of neighborhoods. Now, this is certainly interesting. Here is the article in question, and I will get in here because they're saying systemic racism. Now, why do I have a problem with it? Because actually, College Fix, I think, almost got it right, if I remember seeing it correctly. Investigating just how much. Anyway, they really are not necessarily testing the systemic racism aspect of it. This is why I don't necessarily think the framing at the top is correct here, because, I mean, redlining was a thing. Don't get me wrong. However, we measured the percentage of residents identifying as white in census blocks located within half a kilometer, 1 and 5 kilometers of each sample site using demographic data from the 2010 US Census. So at that point, that is 13 years ago. Presented results from 5-kilometer buffers here, but the results are consistent across scales. So I want to make a note here. Redlining officially happened quite a number of years ago. It was outlawed in 1968. They're taking things now in this time. Well, 13 years ago is when they were using census data for this. So really, I question whether or not this is the effect of redlining per se, as much as it is just some kind of blanket measure of what is the racial variation in particular neighborhoods, in particular cities. That doesn't necessarily count to me, and I think we will get into that in a moment here, particularly. I also don't think that this study particularly shows very well that their results are very well concluded, and I think I will show you a couple of reasons why. Our results provide... Okay, here we go. Our results provide evidence suggesting that demographic and evolutionary processes in urban wildlife vary within U.S. cities in ways that make population persistence in minority neighborhoods more difficult. As expected, most variations in genetic data were associated with species and class level variation captured in our random effects. Conditional R squared, Fixed effects associated with racial composition in our accounted for 1 to 4% of the variation in our models. Now, the proportion, this is why I say they're making a conclusion, but I do think they contradicted it. These proportions of explained variation clearly show that variation in species and class level demographic histories and species-specific interactions with environments are well controlled in our models, and are more important determinants of contemporary genetic diversity and differentiation than effects associated with racial segregation alone. Let me read this whole thing again for you, and then we're going to get into some nerdy stuff with statistics, because there's something about this you need to understand. As expected, most variations in the genetic data were associated with species and class level variation captured in our random effects. Conditional R squared, 34 to 89%, table 1. Fixed effects associated with racial composition account for approximately 1 to 4% of variation in our models. Marginal R squared, table 1. These proportions of explained variation clearly show that variation in species and class-level demographic histories and species-specific interactions with environments are well controlled for in our models and are more important determinants of contemporary genetic diversity and differentiation than effects associated with racial segregation alone. Now, if you're wondering why I'm pausing there, because that actually contradicts the conclusion. To me, that actually contradicts the conclusion in here. To claim that because racial segregation, they're claiming that systemic racism caused this, but yet at the same time, what they just said and the data they just showed does not say that. At least it was not to me. And looking at this graphic here, where they're purporting to say, hey, majority non-white, majority white, which they defined as, 50% or more of the neighborhood has white compared to non-white, is how they broke that up. Effective population size, genetic diversity, allelic richness, again, it has to do with genetics and related things associated with species. This, I forget exactly what it is, but it's measures of genetic diversity, what have you. Does it look to you like there's actually incredible difference? You might be able to best argue it right here, but you really couldn't argue it too much elsewhere. At all. According to just the raw data itself. And now I want to get to the bottom here because they used a what's called a Bayesian generalized linear mixed model in here to start doing their model to try and make these relationships. And what I want to get to is the nerdy part here. It has to do with this table 1. Effects of racial segregation and environment disturbance on genetic composition. Genetic composition of animal species, by the way. So here's the thing. When you're talking about statistics, generally speaking, your R squared is the coefficient of determination. And it basically describes the percentage of the variation of the dependent variable that is explained by the independent variable, or more precisely, the percentage of the variation of the predicand that is explained by a predictor. And I have a cat climbing behind me, by the way. But when you do a mixed effects model, which is what this is, because your regular old R squared is fine for just your normal linear regression. But when you're doing a mixed effects, what are you accounting for? You're counting for fixed effects and you're counting for random effects. When you're dealing with fixed effects, in here, fixed effects are the specific things you are accounting for in the model. Random effects are other things going on because you have maybe different locations. You have different locations. You have different species. You have multiple points for the same space in the same time, for instance. Things like that. And that's why there was a development about 10 years ago to come up with, and apologize, I can see the cats running behind me, to come up with a way to distinguish in a mixed model how much of the variation of the predicand, for example, gene diversity in this case, is explained by the fixed effects versus what is explained by the total of fixed effects and random effects. Oh, I have both cats behind me. I hope something doesn't come crashing to the floor. And that's why I read that one particular statement and why I showed you particular things here. Because, yes, the coefficients might be in a particular direction. However, what is important to me in this is particularly the marginal, what's called the marginal and the conditional R squared. In a mixed effects model, a marginal R squared is the percentage of the variation of the predicand that is explained only by the fixed effects, which is to say, by the effects that you specifically put in as a predictor in your model. In their case, racial segregation of the neighborhood in question. Or the other thing they use, which is a human footprint index, which is basically something it basically defines a certain amount of environmental disturbance. That is why I think it's important to read that statement that I mentioned, but also to come here because they are claiming that their model makes a certain amount. They are claiming that they have significant relationships, which, maybe those coefficients are statistically significant. At the same time, I question whether or not there's any practical significance, and this is why. Right here, for example, this is the highest ones they got with this. Gene diversity versus gene diversity of species predicted by racial segregation, right? Coefficient is positive, so apparently with an increasing number of white residents, there's apparently more gene diversity. Positive relationship like that. Very tiny coefficient, I would notice. Here. But these are the two numbers that strike me with this racial diversity thing. When they said 1% to 4% in that earlier thing, they were talking about this column here. Generally speaking, it's 1 to 4%. You got a little bit that's a little bit higher down here, but that's okay. This is to say that with this marginal R squared, the variation of the predicand gene diversity, only 1% of the variation of that predicand, according to their own model, is explained by racial segregation. 1%. There's the 99%. Whereas 88% is explained by their predicand and every other effect that could be going on, be it space time, what have you, of the other kinds of things that were about this data set. So this is where I say there appears to be quite contradiction in this particular article, and I don't think the title is justified. To point out here that you have less than 10% of everything. Your racial segregation and your human footprint index explains less than 10% of everything. Of every single variable that has to do with animal demography. Forgive me if I don't find that convincing. I don't worry so much about an adjusted R-squared. The reason I don't with this is because it accounts for certain things about model complexity here. What matters to me is when you're talking about a mixed model is what is being explained by the fixed effects versus what's explained by the random effects, and which one of these is, well, the conditional one will always be larger than the marginal because it is fixed plus random effects. And the amount of variation is explained by the two of them together. But if it were really about the fixed effects, I would expect that marginal R-squared to be much closer to the conditional one, particularly in this case. So I frankly don't think the conclusion is necessarily supported, and it's particularly not supported when I just look at it visually. From an eyeball test, there's a crap ton of variation there to begin with. There's a crap ton of variation in that data to begin with, regardless of which variable you're looking at. And at the same time, you still get things that are almost right next to each other. So forgive me if I don't necessarily agree that the data as presented actually supports the conclusions, let alone the fact that you're not actually talking about systemic racism. You're talking about making a relationship between... You're making a relationship with the racial breakdown of census tracts. Actually, you're making a relationship with the racial breakdown of census tracts as of 2010, which is 13 years old. We just did a census recently. We just did a census recently. Yeah, it was the 2020 census. What? So I find it somewhat lacking in actually supporting the conclusion. And frankly, for me, if I was the peer reviewer, I would have been asking that question. You're telling me your conclusion, but I really don't think you necessarily gave me enough support for that conclusion. I could be wrong, but I kind of doubt it. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you liked the video. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, my friends.